Lead us today is our partner in the final workshop, Tracy Walker with RSM. If you are familiar with Tracy, she's led the last three of our workshops that we've had. She's provided us with some amazing insight and expertise on the topic. If you're new today, Tracy is Principal and National Leader of Culture, Diversity, and Inclusion with RSM. We're so fortunate to learn from her and are extremely appreciative of this partnership. Tracy, thank you again, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. It's always my pleasure to be here and to dialogue as folks really are working with intention to create environments that support, celebrate, appreciate diversity, equity, and achieve inclusive outcomes. So excited about the conversation today. Want to lay some ground rules. There'll be tremendous opportunity for us to hear your voice in two ways in particular. One, through polling questions, which will pop up on your screen. They're clickable answers, and then we'll have a little discussion around that. And two, at different points in the conversation, I will ask you if you have a thought you want to share, a story you want to tell, a concern you want to express, or a question, you'll be able to put your name in the chat so we can call on you. And I guess there is a third way. You can just do it the good old-fashioned type of question in the chat team, right? And then we will field those questions as they come across. So those are three ways that we hope you will engage with us in this town hall today. As mentioned, my name is Tracy Walker, and as part of RSM's efforts to work within industries and assist our clients, my focus is on organizational behavior and the intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we get to effective outcomes for our industry, for our enterprise. So that is kind of where my work sits. And so you'll find that I've pulled in some traditional business concepts for us to talk about today as we move through our conversation. Now, one of the things that's so key is when we think about the vocabulary and we think about how it has grown and expanded, and with every conversation, it gets bigger and more interesting. One of the things we touched on early is that employees of inclusive organizations are 45% more likely to grow revenue, or to 70% likely, or to capture new support. So stronger, better, attracting talent, all of the fruits that we want to see can come from getting this right. And that's what we want to talk about. As always, we level set with some definitions. These are things many of you know for sure, but I know we have some new faces and participants on the call with us. So we want to make sure we're all speaking the same thing. We look at diversity as perspective, and we want to appreciate those perspectives. On the back of a $1 bill, it says e pluribus unum. That means from many, one. So if you don't have an appreciation for perspective, then you're not going to succeed from a diversity standpoint. Inclusion, we've discussed, is the actions. How do we behave inclusively towards each other? Equity is an outcome-driven focus. So we're focused on fairness. And finally, belonging, which is sort of the new word, but that's our report card. That's not a grade we can give ourselves. It's something we need others to tell us we're doing right. Now, many of you start in your work, in your conversations, with the business case for inclusion. So we've learned that it matters from a global policy, a peer perspective within our enterprises, and certainly talent. So there's demographic shifts globally, which means we have intercultural dependency. Legislatively, there's new policy, and Wall Street is looking at the world of healthcare from an ESG perspective, environmental, social, where diversity lives, and global governance. I'm sorry, who's running the show? And then from a peer perspective, there is disparity in healthcare outcomes by ethnicity, and it is a problem. From a business perspective, inclusion provides us a competitive advantage in the world of healthcare. And of course, the workforce is looking to work for organizations that have inclusive consciousness. So back to ESG, our conversation today lives in the S. So if any of you are doing work that fits in this ESG space, that's the new hot topic, we'd love to hear from you. I mentioned inclusion drives growth in the 21st century. So this is a continuum. Challenges create growth. To have growth, you need to differentiate yourselves. To differentiate yourself, you need to innovate. To innovate, you need diversity of thought and perspective. To activate that diversity of thought, you need inclusive behavior. And to manage all of this, you need inclusive leadership. So if you're working backwards from the outcome of growth being the goal, the business case is inclusion is absolutely a driver. Now, I will leave you all with this slide, but to the point of the business case, there are 35% more likely to outperform peer data when inclusion and diversity is present. Gender diversity is listed as, an asset in this conversation. The differently abled in terms of higher revenue. And so you see all of these outcomes. Employees have increased job satisfaction and trust. Trust is the speed of inclusion, folks. So we'll talk a bit about that. Profit margin and diverse companies, 158% more likely to understand their target consumer and clients. So in all of these areas, diversity adds value. One of the things we'll touch on in our conversation is challenges that underrepresented non-dominant populations face. So the cost of education and access to preparedness programs is a barrier to expanding diversity within the healthcare industry. There are stereotypical threats. Microaggressions are looked at as barriers to entry. Limited exposure to those in healthcare careers. If I can't see that, I can't be that. And lack of mentors. And then there's a shrinking demand and talent pool relative to the Great Resignation. So what are the great recognition behaviors in all of these buckets that we have talked about that will help us get there? So you may recall some of the facts from our prior conversations, but we really want to get to an inclusive environment where there's equity across the work spectrum. So I'm going to start with a question about you. So I want all of you on this call today to, I'm going to ask for a polling question now so we can pull up the poll. What rating would you give yourself personally on diversity and inclusion in terms of how you see your role, how you see your approach to diversity and inclusion, your thinking on it? So we have some options here. I'm here, but I'm skeptical that we can achieve a different outcome, skeptical that this is a workplace conversation. I'm participating, want to learn more. I believe it's important, but maybe not at work so much. I believe it's important and I understand the business case. I am and want to be a champion for inclusion. So give you just a couple more seconds to weigh in, and we want some honesty from your respective lens. There's no grading or scoring on this poll, but it's an opportunity for us to know the audience today where your mindset is. So I think, team, we've got participants who want to learn. We have participants who believe it's important and understand the business case. The question then becomes outcomes. And then others who want to really, as a first choice, be a champion for diversity and inclusion. So here's where I'll ask you, if you have a story to tell relative to your answer or specific reason that you'd like to share with the group, just put your full name into the chat and we will call on you, and so you can unmute yourself and share your thoughts with us. So team, let me know if we have any brave souls in the chat who'd like to share with us in this first question of the town hall. Do you have a point of view on why you chose the answer that you chose?
Hi, Tracy. We have Mark Trushell.
Mark Trushell.
Hi, Mark
yes.
Trushell.
Hello. I'm with Anchor, Mark Trushell with Anchor. Appreciate the ability to participate in this forum. I chose E. I am or want to be a champion for inclusion for a couple of reasons. As a gay man, and I've been in industries where it has not been easy to be a gay man, I understand how important it is to be a champion, to be an ally, to be somebody on the front lines, to mentor and work very, very hard to make sure that everybody does have that sense of belonging. So it's very personal for me, but also in my sort of coming up to speed, learning about DEI initiatives, especially over the last couple of years, I know that it's the right thing for, not only the right thing to do, but it's also the right thing for business. Retention, promoting unique and diverse ideas. It's the right thing for a business to do. So that's why I chose that.
Thank you, Mark. And I think you introduced a very important point that we can lean into in this conversation, is your perspective allows you to take the perspectives of others as you consider things like policy and programming. The perspective you bring, not only as an executive in the industry, but as a person who's a member of a group that has struggled with its own areas of being included and sometimes excluded. You have a point of view that allows the enterprise to hear a different voice. And I think the challenge we have working in this dynamic is getting other leaders to kind of walk in other people's shoes as they consider choices, directions, outcomes. And part of that, friends, comes from the experiences we create for them. So town halls with employees, courageous conversations with your executives, conferences, workshops, internal or external, where people who are member of the dominant majority interact in a different setting with those who are non-dominant groups or minority groups. So Mark, thank you for sharing that and allowing us to open the door and touch on vulnerability, sharing your story, and the perspectives that we bring that are multidimensional. So appreciate that. Anyone else wanted to share before we move on? Or are we okay to move on?
We're okay to move on. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Okay, so now let's look at enterprise leadership. So we talked about a maturation process and how organizational behavior can be influenced. You've heard culture eats strategy for breakfast. So a lot of us start out in a monocultural way. The way we do things is the way we've always done them. Then we move to compliance. We do only the things we have to do. Then we get some multicultural appreciation, a diverse mix of employees. But in that, we can struggle to optimize diversity and inclusion. And then are we inclusive, which means do we have everyone's input? We start to ask the questions that let us consider points of view as assets. So we go from aspiring to emerging, managing to optimizing. Now, and bias is embedded in every enterprise. My own firm is nearly 100 years old. And so we have these unconscious biases born into us to help us be safe, to help us take mental shortcuts. But we want to move from unconscious bias to conscious, which means we've got to disrupt some things sometimes. As we become conscious, we'll be shifting mindsets through conversation, through empathy, through learning. We'll move to living the consciousness. So we become conscious about including, and then we want to get to a place where it's unconscious inclusion. We are reinforcing good behaviors. One leadership group that we work with has said that they need safe space to be leaders, to be vulnerable. They don't want to blow themselves up, blow up their career. And so they would like to get to a place where they're living inclusive mindsets. So we'll talk about how we get them there. You know, one of the things we know is that a world that doesn't support diversity and inclusion can lead to bad outcomes. And organizations have to go beyond just counting hires and counting recruiting. We need to be inclusive with the people we have, but unfortunately, managers think they're great judges of talent. What we learn is that they may not be. Even those who are committed to equality and promoting diversity fall prey to biases. So we have to help our leaders challenge our biases. As I mentioned, we naturally have them. I'm no doubt has spent a lot of time on this. And most of our biases are unconscious. They're habits that we have formed. But we have to ask ourselves, what if the opposite were true? How do I get to a place of trust? You have to be curious. You see these questions that leaders consider. How do I develop my people? What do they need? Don't assume, ask. That's a courageous, inclusive ask. And so you can use quantitative data, look at factual evidence about promotions, who's getting promoted within your organization. The qualitative data, what gets measured gets done. So how do we reinforce behavior? How do we use a reverse feedback or upward feedback to call out those who are doing good things in a qualitative way and then reward them? So two sides of the same coin. We want to focus on that. And then quickly, we know the 80-20 rule. We focus on 80% of the population who are functioning well and what they need and need more of. And the 20%, you know, survival of the fittest. Either they cut it and get to fitting in or they don't. Well, the new IQ says that if we focus on those who are underrepresented and meet them where they are, they need a little confidence building. So we give them a stretch assignment. We spend some time letting them know we have high expectations. We will then see them improve and we can get to a 100% optimized entity because we focused on essentially the weakest link or those who are challenged. And so it requires some intention from leadership to get to a high performing population. We call it an I lead journey, which is inclusion starts with I, meaning I am responsible, but it also stands for learning, engaging, asking, not assuming, and then developing people as they go. So if you have thoughts about that or a story about aha moments that maybe your leaders have achieved and want to share, please put your name in the chat so we can call on you. But we want to talk more about how we create a more inclusive workplace. What can we do to be more inclusive? I'm curious, team, if we have anyone with us today who's taken some good steps in that direction. This is a town hall, so others learn from your sharing, even if your story had a bad outcome, or even if you're just starting, we'd love to hear from you. As we get names in the chat who'd like to speak up, I want to remind us of some things that we learned. So you see them on your screen: assessing the current organizational DEI structure, identifying indicators of success. What are the KPIs there? Incorporating small changes for big impact. One-on-one conversations matter. So you don't have to change the world and have a huge conference at an amphitheater to achieve an outcome. It can be a small group at a time. And then with these inclusive actions need to come accountability. So someone needs to ask the question, who are you responsible for? How are they doing? And then how are they really doing in this virtual environment with all of this stress? We want to get to an equitable, bias-free environment, but again, inclusion starts with I, and we want to make sure that we are recognizing our own responsibility for inclusive outcomes. So Krista, any folks who want to chime into the conversation at this point?
We have no names, but I have listed questions in the chat for individuals to think about as soon as, or if you have something you'd like to share, I'll call on you just as soon as you put your name.
Okay, so let's move to the next polling question. And here's where we get to some of the more challenging aspects of our work. What concerns do you have regarding diversity and inclusion? And we'd like you to select the top 2 concerns so we can look at, what is really driving the barriers to success. So one is that D&I is a trend that may, disappear. Next is change, that we don't want to change our standards. We hear that a lot as an objection to embracing inclusion, as if inclusion is a negative and has some detriment. So that's a real objection. Representation, we don't have much diversity, and we have challenges with it. Recruiting is a big challenge in some cases, and ROI, people want to know how this directly impacts their bottom line and that they can account for revenue when it comes to inclusion. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes or a few more seconds, as it were, Krista, for them to get this answer in. And in some cases, either where your recruiting is limited or the population that applies to work with the organization is limited in its diversity. So all of these things are real life examples. So it looks like representation received the most, followed by, is D&I a trend? So from a representation standpoint, we don't have much diversity in our firm now. And this is a concern because, again, you can't see what you can't be. Some people don't feel comfortable unless they feel a sense of affinity. And in those cases where representation is low, we really have to make sure our behaviors are inclusive, welcoming, and people feel safe to be authentic. What we're going to go into next is the 4 stages of inclusive safety, of the kind of safety that creates a thriving, inclusive culture. But thank you for that. For those who say, we don't want to change our standards, inclusion and all of the data shows, as we mentioned earlier in the business case, that companies who embrace inclusion outperform their peers. So if you think by avoiding inclusion, you're going to maintain higher standards and higher performance, your challenge is going to be relevance into the future with the titanic kinds of shifts that are happening demographically. To be relevant, this is something that you need to embrace. Does anyone have a thought or comment on these challenges that they'd like to share? Have you run into a brick wall within your organization where there's just a fear or reluctance to change, or people are looking at this from a risk perspective? Any thoughts there? And if not, we will keep going, but wanted to give you an opportunity to share all of these things.
Cornelia Seidel has put her name in the chat to share.
Okay, Cornelia, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think, my mind I have so many different thoughts here, so I'll just try to keep it brief. But I think one of the, concerns, and then I would say, maybe not a failure, but something I'm working towards right now is just it was one of the previous slides that you showed, but kind of like the qualitative and quantitative, like tracking of progress has been, definitely a challenge, because I feel like on one side of the coin, there's so many different measurables that I could be putting into place, and so many different things that I could kind of like metric and, try to tie numbers back to and look at, percentages. And then on the flip side, there is, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, some hesitance to even putting numbers around it, but I want to be able to track progress, not only for myself or like how the job is going, but also so that the rest of the company can see, are we improving? Are we pushing the needle? That kind of thing. So
Yeah.
chat more about that, but don't want to take up too much time. So that's one
No,
thing.
I appreciate that. And that is an absolute, very traditional concern. Where do I start? How do I use data? And if you really think from the outcome backward, if the outcome is we have an equitable organization where the behaviors are known, that is attracting diverse perspectives and where they can thrive and be successful, what does our data tell us about how we're doing in that realm? So first, how many people have taken training? So we know they've at least heard these terms, they're conscious of the actions. Next, are we recruiting in diverse places, and are we telling our story that we're really committed to diverse perspectives? As we look at our talent that exists today, do we have any inequities in who gets promoted? Or when we have a panel or a forum, do we make sure there's women represented, that there's visually diverse representation before our workforce? And how many panels have we had where it hasn't been? So there's a variety of ways to look at data from the perspective of what are your goals, to see if you're moving in the right direction, trending in the right direction. And if not, that's data that you can then escalate, raise the hand and say, listen, I think if we can really pay attention to this and start to apply some energy and focus, we can change some outcomes here. So thank you for that comment, Cornelia. And it is something that everyone tends to be challenged by. So we went through the polling question. If anyone else has comments about what's they're thinking about in terms of creating an inclusive environment, we welcome that. One of the things we covered in our series was the talent experience, inviting a diverse perspective. And one of the messages that we encourage you to think about is, how could you tell your entire workforce from the bottom up to the very top, highest echelon, that they are cultural architects, meaning they individually are modeling behavior and telling a story with their words and actions. Are they comfortable? Are they uncomfortable? Do they use microaggressions inadvertently and then laugh about it? Well, the reason this is important is because when any talented person, or I dare say patients, our clients, our customers, come into our environment, threat detectors are up. We have a bias towards things that are familiar, a positive bias towards things that are familiar. We have a negative bias towards things that are new. So when you think about walking into your environment, people's threat detectors are up. If they find it's a safe space, they are going to be more engaged, and their response is going to be performance oriented. If they find they're in an unsafe environment, their response is going to be more survival oriented. Now, in the survival mode, how do we behave? We hide our problems, we're disengaged. All of these things present challenges to us. But guess what happens if we're in performance mode? We are engaged, focused, high performing. We can be authentic. We are safe to be ourselves. And that's what happens so often. We have a wonderful new hire that we have high expectations of, but because no one's communicated to that person or is mentoring, telling them they're valued, they end up in survival mode. They're kind of shut down and closed off. And everyone's thinking, wow, this person is not what we thought. It's about the safe or unsafe space that we create, which is a combination of I respect your perspective and I give you permission to engage, to learn, to contribute, and to challenge me as your leader. So to the question that creates these negative experiences, sometimes being the only has that effect. 25% of all employees are the only on some dimension, some level. And so we need to be thoughtful about how we create teams and how we invite teams to contribute. 34% of women are the onlys thinking of leaving their jobs in the next 2 years. So think about the employees that you can't live without. And ask yourself, have we had the kind of conversation that lets them know they are valued, we care about their journey, and we want you to succeed here? If you're just assuming that they know that, then there's a problem. Harvard Business Review says that belonging has a huge increase on their willingness to recommend the organization, on, feeling that they are, they have job satisfaction and that they can perform beyond what expectations are. So you see the statistics here. If you want to cut turnover, belonging is good for business. And the data that we talked about, Cornelia, the activities, the commitment that you had, Mark, is all about creating that safe space in the center of belonging. So what are some of the pillars of that? Social bonds, fostering trusting relationships, practicing empathy, being intentional about inclusion, integration. And by that, it's not, types of people being integrated. It's more about including, embedding inclusion into everything you do, who you put in front of people, teams that are going to serve or design solutions or manage projects, the voice of your workforce. Do they have platforms where they can share their story or their point of view? On submarines, the captain of a submarine spends a lot of time with the person who's mopping the floor. And we talk about that, meaning that they're not afraid to ask the lowest person on the totem pole what's happening in their lives. Why is that? They do that because they want the eyes and ears of every person. It could mean the difference between saving lives while they're, miles under the sea, or not. And so if your organization is blind or trying to suppress the voices of everyone, then you're not creating that inclusive, equitable environment with consistency. And Krista, I'm going to ask you to just stop me if someone wants to get
Yes,
in.
we have Scott, excuse me if I pronounce your name incorrectly, Seahawk. He had brought his name up whenever we had done the polling question as well.
Okay, Scott, maybe you can unmute yourself now and share your thoughts. I'm sorry we moved ahead before you got to chime in, but welcome your comment.
No worries. Can you hear me okay, Tracy?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for putting this together with Krista. I think this was going back to an earlier question. I think a lot of people worry about where to start the conversation. This is a huge topic. And speaking with colleagues and finding out is you just have to start the conversation. And surprising, once you do that, you really start getting a lot of feedback from individuals. I believe this is a topic that's going to be in existence forever. And it requires a starting point and a constant commitment, just keep working, towards that, making sure individuals in the organization are involved and know that this is something that's very thoughtful, that everyone's working together. And I kind of started this initiative about a year ago, and it requires constant attention and constant work. And I was really very thankful when I saw that you put this topic together. Education around it, I'm not an expert in it, but it just requires constant reading and constant learning and constant promoting.
I think you're right. And one of the approaches, Scott, thank you for that, is how do we get grassroots energy behind it, in addition to leadership and the things that are kind of invited or dictated in some cases from the top down. It's sort of a both and strategy. One of the things that we like to do is just start simple. Tell me your story. And you find a couple of things. You know, People Magazine was founded and is so successful because they say that the most interesting thing to people is other people. So we've had forums and sessions where we've gotten 4 employees from different areas to just tell their story, their background, how they got here, how they got to this role. But some of them are very personal in terms of things they do outside of work, or they got into healthcare because they had a relative with an illness and they wanted to affect change in some way. And in the sharing comes empathy, and in the empathy comes, I want people like this to have a good experience here. I'm going to change how I behave or how I treat this person. That's one aspect. Another aspect is it's not me, it's them. So by that, I mean, we present a problem to a small group. So there's an employee feeling excluded, and the employee is the only person on their team and so on. What things could we do as an organization? So we're not talking about self now. We're talking about some other organization, some who's not getting it right. But you'd be surprised at how people chime in with offerings of solutions. And in that ideation comes programs and thinking that can be valuable. So you're absolutely right about keeping your foot on the gas, starting small, rewarding good behavior, an inclusion newsletter that calls out someone's great action. All of those things are things that keep it top of mind, because it's not us versus them from a race or gender perspective. It's we are working together to be more inclusive. So Scott, thank you for that so much. So the absence of inclusive leadership, you might ask me, Tracy, isn't treating everyone the same enough to make me an inclusive leader? The answer is no. There is a difference between equality and equity. Equality is, yes, we've given everyone the same thing, but darned if some people aren't succeeding. In this example, darned if some people still aren't eating and they leave our organization hungry. Equity is being intentional about meeting people where they are. We give people IDI assessments in our leadership workshops. One person who scored 100%, which means not only do they appreciate diverse perspectives, but they lean into them like they're an asset that's going to set their performance apart. The lower scores, well, we'll talk about that, I think, coming up. But the point is, what's the behavior of a person who's being intentional about meeting people where they are so everyone can eat? It's an interesting question. Are you giving constructive feedback to all members of your team with consistency? Is a question we ask our leaders, because naturally they feel an affinity with someone who went to the same university as they did, comes from the same hometown, is the same ethnic background or gender. But what about those who are different? We struggle as leaders with difference. And what that results in is some people feeling respected. People talk with them, they explore different outcomes, they're problem solving, they're engaging, they're open-minded, and others who feel like suspects. People talk about me more than they talk with me. People evaluate me as opposed to exploring a solution and valuing my point of view. They're problem finding, they're always looking for what I did wrong, as opposed to problem solving and coaching me. So you see the suspecting experience on the left, and you see the respecting behaviors and experience on the right. And in our surveys, we find that they're fundamental questions. So Scott, to your point, if half your workforce is saying, do I belong? And does even my team, do they value me? Then we have to work with individuals, managers, partners, teams to plot out the career path, to say, I see you have a future here. We want you to be successful. You have to be explicit about the things that very often go unsaid. And when you do that, the quote at the bottom, a first generation professional, a number of things are new, but now they're feeling safe space to ask questions, whereas before they were afraid. And in the fear are the mistakes that we want so terribly to avoid. And so, as we talked about on a call, we need both inclusion and diversity. If you just have diversity and the environment is not inclusive, you're going to have lower performance. If you have a team of folks who are all the same, you may get average performance. But if you have diversity and intention around inclusion, you are going to get to higher performance and higher revenue. And everyone needs a differentiator for their business right now. So this, friends, is our goal. So we learned in that session that we develop equitably, we need feedback equitably. People who receive support and relevant support are more successful. And so there are going to have to be assessments of your current recruiting and retention efforts, but that's just one part of it. Who's getting training? Who's in the focus group or the courageous conversation with your leaders? Who's answering the question, how are you doing? How are you really doing? Such that you can hear honest answers and help your employees with their experiences. You know, we often talk about the benefits of what happens in inclusion, but here's a question. What are you missing without it? I love this cartoon because the ear is a fan. No, this big thing is a wall. No, I think it's a rope. No, I think it's a tree. And so everyone thinks they have the answer. No one's talking to each other. Assumptions all over the place. That is our work environment sometimes. That's what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So without it, we miss a lot. So within your organizations, what's your end state is my question. Has someone expressed goals? Krista, do we have folks who want to chime in on this conversation? Do you have goals that you stated? What does the future state of inclusion look like? And Krista, just wave at me if you get some you want me to stop for. My dear friend, Stephanie Creary at Wharton says inclusive leadership is 50% of the reason people stay or go. Whether I have a mentor who cares about me and whether my manager is involved in my life and understands who I am and what it is that I need really matters. It's over 58% of the reason that I'm here. Now, workplace policies, training, the compliance end of the spectrum is important, but look at what is qualitative, the people controlled factors that really drive performance outcomes. And so mentoring is a big thing. Do you have a mentor program? If you don't, and there's a void there, then your people are at risk. It's 33% of whether they'll stay or go. Are managers involved with your employees in terms of their work-life balance, their well-being? How are they really doing? If not, then you're 25% likelier to have some kind of impact that comes from inclusion there. So just want to make sure that you all are conscious of those outcomes. So here we are on the spectrum, and I just want you all to know this. The IDI, the Intercultural Development Institute, has this IDC continuum. And all of us fall on the spectrum in one way or another. So it starts with denial. What are we missing? I don't want to know about difference. I'm fine just functioning. I treat everyone nice. That's it. Full stop. Polarization says, yes, I see difference. I see my group, people who were raised like me, who are like me where I'm from, educated like me. And frankly, if I'm honest, I think my group is a little better than those other groups, right? So not only do you see difference, but you judge it and feel superior. Minimization is, I just want to find what we have in common. That's so much easier, Tracy, than focusing on difference and asking someone a personal question and making a misstep. So let's just focus on what we have in common. How about the weather? Is summer ever going to get here? My goodness, right? How somebody's laughing. I love that. So how do we get past weather, folks? And really get into what matters and what's fascinating about people. The next is acceptance. That means I want to deeply comprehend our differences. Tell me about yourself. Tell me about your background. Tell me what you like to do when you're heading away from work. Again, the elephant, what might we be missing if we don't know the next dimension of our colleagues and our professionals? And then lastly, bridges across difference. This is where the 100% scores come in. So I told you about that leader who scored a 100%, which is rare. A lot of people live in acceptance. And what I love about this measurement is that it gives you a perceived score, what you think of yourself, and then it gives you your actual behavior. And believe me, friends, what we think of ourselves in this space and what we actually are is very different. We have a lot of women, believe it or not, that are in polarization, and they're appalled when they get their score. So why do you think that is? It's because some women walk into a meeting room and they expect to be judged or talked over. They expect their opinion not to be valued. They expect some men in the room to dominate. And so they kind of have their mental dukes up when they walk into a meeting. They are living polarization. So we have to ask them, well, what if you gave them the benefit of the doubt and had high expectation and spoke to them in that way? Well, Steve, I know you didn't mean to step on my thought there. So I know you're going to let me finish. Let me just tell you what I was going to say, and then you can chime in or something, right? It's behaving according to our inclusive understanding. The last thing I'll say on this is the person that got 100% score, he gave us an example of something he does. He's a majority person, a white male, and he has an African-American female who he thought was very talented, but he could tell she wasn't exceptionally confident. She had competency, she wasn't confident. So he decided not to label and judge her, but to say to her, hey, would you have lunch with me? And in his conversations, he spent more time with her, telling her that he thought she could be successful. Then he gave her stretch assignments, a little beyond what she was doing today. And she handled it masterfully. And then her confidence started to grow. And he started to learn about the fact that she was the only on the team. And that might have caused her to be more introverted and reserved. But he was not afraid to lean in to bring out the best in the person. And that, my friends, is adaptation-oriented, inclusive behavior. So whether you're the person who the mentor has plucked out to help you get from good to great, or whether you're the person in the boardroom expecting a battle, so you're in polarized mode, there are behaviors and consciousness that go along with our success in this area. So let's get to our last polling question. Where do you believe you are on the IDI continuum yourself? And this could be most of the time, right? So give that some thought as we introduce that poll, because I know we might feel one way at church or out with our friends, and then we feel differently when we get into our conference room and are about to have that Monday meeting. So most of the time, where do you think you are on the IDI continuum? let's see, Krista, what this audience thinks of themselves. Now, I encourage you to take this assessment because, again, you get 2 scores. You get the where I think I am score, and you get the how do I behave when the chips are down score. And you can see the difference. That second score lets you know how people see you also. And so we have a lot of people that just want to focus on the commonalities. There's a movie where, you know, a matchmaker is teaching someone to dance. And he says, you know, don't go all outside and do the John Travolta, just stay right here in these two steps, right in the middle, right? And so it's very funny. So in this, it's people wanting to stay right in the middle in that safe space. But we do have some people that truly appreciate difference, that seem to be leaning in, that seem to be comfortable accepting and appreciating difference and valuing it as assets. And then there are those who candidly, and thank you for your candor, say that, hey, I'm in denial. I miss difference. We're all human beings. I would just like to stay in my human being mode, be Minnesota nice or Nashville nice in this case, and keep that moving. So imagine being in a workplace where people have all of these different mindsets. What a challenging and interesting job we have bringing these folks together to get to a good outcome. Any thoughts on the IDI or the sort of the maturation of inclusion? Again, drop a question in the chat. We don't have to unmute you to answer a question, or put your name in the chat, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and what you're experiencing.
Cordelia asked a really great question of the link for the IDI assessment. Susanna has put that in the chat for anyone who's interested.
Yes, and it might be worth investing in having a qualified administrator of the IDI on your team. The training for that is about $2,000, but then you have an administrator on staff who could administer the assessment across the organization, and you get group and team scores. So you can tell if a team has high turnover and lots of bias, where the individuals are, and you can discuss it as a team. The individual scores can be kept confidential, but either way, you want some kind of instrument to raise people's awareness, and people love to talk about themselves and think about themselves. Gee, I'm curious how I show up on this IDI. Now you've got them talking about inclusion, right? So anything that brings them to the table is helpful. So I know we don't have a lot of time left. I just want to leave you with a couple of things. Inclusive leaders are individuals who are self-aware. They're aware of their own biases, yet they actively seek out different perspectives so that they can make better decisions, so that they can collaborate with others more effectively. In other words, they lean right into the heart of their fear. And that separates the good from the great in this workspace. So 4 quick things that you're going to see in your deck when you get this. These are the 4 areas of safety that leaders need to create. Inclusion safety says I belong. Learner safety says I can ask a question. Contributor safety says I have my point of view matters to someone. And challenger safety says if I see something wrong, I can say something. I'm not going to suffer from retaliation. Inclusion safety, basic human need to connect, to be authentic, that we are members of something, and we're not subject to ridicule and rejection and humiliation. Think bullying in elementary school, or when you don't get chosen for the team. Dr. Stephen Robbins, great author of one of my favorite books called What If, says exclusion feels like physical pain. And in the healthcare industry, what we don't want is to inflict pain. So inclusion is an imperative. Learner safety is the intersection of respect and permission. We feel safe to ask questions, to discover, to learn new methods, best practices. Contributor safety, I feel safe contributing and making a difference. My work is valued by someone. We lean into what we're doing with enthusiasm when we have this kind of safety. And lastly, challenger safety. Could we do this better? Do you mind if I offer a thought on this? Why do we do it this way again? I'm just curious because I tried it this other way and it was fantastic. We are much more efficient. Can you challenge the status quo? Are you safe in doing that? So there are some actions around each of these safety areas. Inclusion safety means inviting people in, not allowing them. You need an ID card and a VIP and a blah, blah, blah. No, we invite people in. Learning safety means discussing efforts, asking questions. How are you doing? Contributing, moving from telling them what to do to asking for input. I value your contribution. And challenger safety means protect individuals when they're being vulnerable. Even if their idea is bad and they're wrong, protect their opportunity to share. So it's like growing a tree. We start with helping recognize the character, treating everyone with consistency, and their competencies will grow. Stephen Covey, the speed of trust, is really the speed of inclusion. I've had him speak at a number of our workshops and conferences. So I'll lastly leave you with the question, what action will you take to personally impact culture, diversity, inclusion in your organization? And I'd like to just take a moment to thank you for being here. This is an action that we hope will put some thoughts, some tools, some ideas, some conversation in your toolbox as you go back and fight the good fight around inclusion. So first action, applause for taking this first step. And this has been recorded and will be shared, Krista, right? So that we'll have this. And then feel free to reach me if you have other questions going forward. We want to get everyone on the maturity continuum, and there's some information about the things RSM does to help you all get there and achieve that power of inclusion. Feel free to reach out to me. I am on LinkedIn, Tracy Walker, RSM, and I'm sure I'll be connected with the organization for things forward. But in the meantime, I'd love to hear from you. So thank you all for your time. Krista, I'm going to turn it back to you now.
Awesome. Thank you again, everyone. And thank you, Tracy, for investing your time as well. We appreciate the conversation. We will be continuing to pull this group together and individuals who sign up for our DEI communications about every other month. So keep watching for more information and have a great evening. Thank you for a wonderful workshop.